you've summoned me tonight because you want to talk more about H.G. Wells.
Yes, I've summoned you. I've done the
Okay.
incantation.
You like a glutton for punishment that you keep wanting to examine this guy?
Well, oh, I think inside of me there's probably a small dwarf or midget, or else a little masochist of some kind. I'm not sure. But
If people weren't espousing his ideas these days, I would say you're a masochist, but so many people are like, this is a great idea.
yeah,
No.
yeah, yeah. That's what prompted my question on Facebook, by the way. I've been listening to James Lindsay, as I don't know if you listen to him or not, but I think he's absolutely fantastic to listen to. One of these days, he's got to convert to Christianity. If nothing else, that's the only bastion left. But anyway, he's fascinating. He's been doing a read-through of My Struggle, which in German is Mein Kampf.
Yes, so I heard.
Written by that little corporal. And it's really fascinating to listen to it, not just because Lindsay makes comments and is connecting it to the alt-right, if that's a thing, but also because it's interesting to hear Hitler writing and hear these echoes on the one hand of things that are happening right now.
Like people who say, I would never be a Nazi, and then are espousing exactly ideas written in My Struggle.
You already are. It's not a question of whether you would be. You already are a Nazi, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
You just don't have the power yet in the snappy Hugo Boss uniforms, But no, it's the other strain that's really interesting to me is that Hitler, this is going to sound really weird, in a lot of things he says, when he's not moping about his incel condition, some of the things he's saying are really, they're important critiques of his own society. He really is critiquing certain things that he sees going wrong. So I guess it's, in a way, it's like, it's giving me an insight. It is something I'm working through anyway, which is villains are not always these slimy, green-skinned, moo-ha-ha-ha types. They're frequently people that are quite rational and make.
Or no, I'm going to hold you back to that. Quite rational people who are quite sympathetic as you listen to them, but rational, no, that's actually quite crazy.
Terminology, yes, you're right. They sound rational on the outside.
Sound, yes.
Yeah, and instead, when they start talking about the Jew, then you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they sound rational, and they seem to be sympathetic in many ways, and their motives are often motivated by worries and desires and hopes that you and I share, and many people of great will share. And that's my video on Thanos.
I like your video on Thanos, and I would give a plug for it right here.
Well, thank you. I'm mulling it over for several days, and I finally made that video. It took me a while, and I'll probably get doxxed for having Marvel content in my video, but whatever, who cares? But yeah, that's kind of my point, is that reading through these guys, all these progressives in general, you find this strain of worry or concern or love of certain things that I think, yeah, I share that. Madison Grant, similar thing when I was reading about him. The concern over poverty and suffering and of loss of the supposedly beautiful culture that had been raised up there in America. I think all that stuff, those are things that I have shared and still to a great deal share. Now, his solution of wipe out an entire race of people is probably not something that I want to go down.
Well, that's the weird thing, is because they keep saying, at first they're saying things that you completely agree with. Like if you ever, I mean, I don't recommend reading Paul Ehrlich because he's really annoying, but if you start out with is like, there's the possibility of terrible famine coming up. There's the possibility of misery and homelessness everywhere, and ruined families, ruined lives. And you're like, yeah, I agree. And therefore, so see, we must kill 1 billion people in order to solve this. Like, whoa, where did that come from?
Oh, that got out of control really fast. I mean, that really
got that escalated quickly.
You're right. Paul Ehrlich's a classic example. And I think a lot of people in the 60s and 70s, when he was writing, were seeing that as a real problem. I mean, you see it in movies all the time. The Planet of the Apes, The Escape from New York, the Silent Running,
Soylent Green,
all these different movies are like, yeah, this is really getting dastardly. So But I think with Adolf's writings, he has these desires for beauty and for the old way and for tradition and honor and values, and he's critiquing this sort of slide into ignorance and stupidity and violence and loss of the family. And I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, yeah, he's got a
Yeah.
point. He's got
And
a
he's right up until the moment when he says, and therefore we should create a tyrannical dictatorship and kill an entire race of people.
right. That whole like
Wait.
oh, whoa, slow down. I question, which I think you answered there on Facebook, which I found kind of intriguing, is that if we had not gone to war with him, would his ideas, on the one hand, have been as despised as they were after the war? And second, would they have been actually implemented without any problem?
I didn't precisely answer that question. I just commented that since your colleague had said he was so heavily influenced by these groups in America, I commented that those groups are still here in America and still exceptionally well funded.
Yeah,
And I feel that that should be somewhat alarming.
it is very alarming. It's very alarming. And by he, you mean Hitler was influenced, not
Yes.
my colleague. Yes.
Yeah, Hitler was influenced by the American eugenicist movement, as you and I have discussed before. Um, and not just the American eugenicist movement, but all that group that was connected towards the project to change society completely.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Still there.
And this is something which I hear in the Mein Kampf thing is this idea to change society completely, to go back to the old way, to wipe the slate clean, to make everything neat and orderly and tidy. And there's I think a strong desire in many people, even those of goodwill, to say we really want to stop the violence. We really want to stop the poverty, the grinding poverty. We want to stop the ignorance. We want to stop the, I mean, look at England. Nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants that. You don't want the women that are afraid to walk the streets at night, and the gang killings and the riots. You don't want that. But what's your solution gonna be? That's the problem, isn't it? If
Yeah.
your solution is just turn the other cheek, well, there goes the old Britain. And
Equally well, the solution, we simply need to exterminate an entire group of
and if
people.
you go that
Doesn't work.
all over again. Yes, it doesn't work.
Just because it's opposed to one wrong idea does not make it right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's been an interesting thing. I highly recommend listening to Lindsay read it because I never intended to read Mein Kampf. That was like way down on my reading list. Um, but hearing him read it and hearing him comment on it all the way is kind of the way to go because you could kind of digest the material as you go and think, he's really on to something, but he's got really bad conclusions. You can kind of pick that up as you go. So it's a bit like I said, Madison Grant, a similarly driven character, and even I hate to say this to some degree, Margaret Sanger. And this sounds really horrible, I think, to a lot of folks. But when you look at people like Margaret Sanger, she wasn't driven initially by what we would call a directly evil desire to wipe out another race, any more than many of those eugenicists were. They were driven by, I think, a real desire to end the poverty and the misery that they saw. The people they were working with on a regular basis were living in grinding poverty. And because they worked primarily with inner city Black families, that was the group that they thought we need to reduce the population and that will improve or boost their economy. I think people working in the Appalachian Project might have a similar idea. You work with those
That's
dirt.
the one where they sterilized so many people who were in the Appalachians. Is that the one you're referring to?
Eventually do so. But initially the working in the Appalachian Project was going out there and trying to educate and to alleviate poverty and to feed the dirt poor white families of Scottish and Irish descent. But eventually it got to the idea of let's help them wipe themselves out.
Mhm.
It's like the law of unintended consequences in a way, although I wonder if the consequences are only somewhat unintended. That you don't intend to do evil, but you intend to do something which otherwise would be evil because it's practical, it's pragmatic, or whatever it is. Does that make sense at all? Like mathematically, it lines up that if you wipe out half the population, the other half should be getting richer. And so you're like, let's just wipe out the half of the population. Not because you hate that group, but because you see in them such grinding poverty that you want to alleviate. And so you say, okay, this would make mathematical sense. But if morality and humanity and made in the image likeness of God are thrown out, if that's not part of the equation, I can definitely see where a person would say, yeah, it's fine. You wipe out half and the other half prospers. Let's do it. Let's put it into practice. Okay. Not that
I
I,
can see it starts that way. I do agree
yeah,
with you then. Um, I think one of the things that people get confused about is that they see the end result. They see Hitler screaming and spit flying all over the place. That's the end result.
yeah.
Because by the time you're getting close to the end, you do have a monster at that point. But your
Mhm.
point is, it doesn't start as a monster. They started human.
No, there's a great movie. I don't know if you saw it called Conspiracy, which is
It's
about,
an excellent movie.
yeah,
Excellent movie.
really puts this kind of thought into practice. It's about the Swansea conference, which there's no footage or actual official record of that conference, but my understanding is that some of the things talked about were smuggled out by one or two members. But
One copy of the notes of that conference, one copy
is that
was
right?
allowed. All the others were destroyed.
Hmm. Well, whatever the case, the movie is absolutely phenomenal, and it depicts the decision that was made by the very top brass of the Nazi regime to exterminate the Jews, because they thought at first they could just round them up and put them in these camps, and that would solve the problem by keeping them. First it was the ghettos, and then they put them in the camps, and they hadn't yet decided whether to exterminate them. And this movie depicts the debate that occurred that led to that. And what's really stunning, excuse me for a minute, because I'm about to run out of battery here.
Hmm.
Really stunning about that is that the debate is so calm and collected, and I don't know, one could even say decent.
Yes, they might as well have been sitting there discussing how to increase grain shipments. That's
Yeah,
all it was.
right, right. It could have been just something like that. So
You're now on your side.
yeah, it does that. I have to press numerous buttons in order to get my machines to work. It's one of the reasons I don't think machines will ever take over the universe.
Okay, brief interlude. This is actually something quite funny that some of my friends from the FBI said into me. They
Okay.
actually did run an experiment to have a whole corporation where every job in it was actually AI to see how well it would function in it. And it was a catastrophe. I mean, at every point which required what we regard as normal human decision making, the AI technically followed what was correct with grossly wrong results. Like when you're supposed to inform your supervisor of something and you can't get your supervisor, you and I would try and call a different number or maybe walk over to see what they're. I don't know. The AI simply renamed another unit as the supervisor.
Oh, that's so funny.
So there's all that. Then they were joking, what will happen as soon as you try and make FBI investigations all AI? Clever and artistic criminals will very quickly overwhelm that system.
Because they'll learn how to work the system. Yeah, absolutely.
Have to find the glitch. There's
Yep.
always a glitch.
Yep. No, that's funny. It's probably I'm more worried about AI destroying the world than I am about AI taking over the world. You know, like the AI will have they'll like put the missile defense system under the AI, and the AI will like work out that we're being attacked or something when we're not being attacked. We're like, launch all the missiles now,
Yeah.
something like that. Or even more like mundane. You know, all of the junk mail will be delivered to North America from the entire world, and we get buried in it. You know, from some
I do
not
remember that was a joke from Motel of the Mysteries was the book. That was a great joke.
produced by Macaulay. It's a great
Yeah.
book.
And Civilization, because all the junk mail there.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. So back to this issue. The other great movie that I always think is worth watching. I mean, there's Generation War, which is a really good series. If you haven't seen Generation War, it's the World War II from the German perspective, and it's like Brothers in Band of Brothers, the same
mhm.
quality of filming, only it's in German. So fantastic. But it shows how many Germans were on board with the let's make a better Germany and let's follow this guy and let's do what he wants. They weren't so much on board with the, hey, let's invade our neighbors thing when that happened. But then they did it. And then all of a sudden they found themselves caught on this like meat grinder thing that they thought, this is really ridiculous. This is terrible. And then when rumors got out of what was actually happening, they were just appalled by this, many of them. But they had been so drawn into this machine of war and propaganda that and cult of personality that they couldn't get out afterwards. So they found themselves still traumatized by this. So, and Lindsay reads actually, I think before his Mein Kampf escapade, he reads a work of a woman who's apologizing to her former friend or childhood friend who was a Jew about her joining the Hitler Youth, because the authoress of this book joined the Hitler Youth early on, and she was explaining why that happened, how that happened. It's really it's fascinating psychologically. So, oh, and then the last thing I recommend, the movie Downfall, which I think is fantastic, absolutely amazing, about Hitler in the bunker.
Yes,
Fantastic.
the people have made so many funny memes.
Yeah, the meme.
That's a very good movie.
Yeah, very good movie. But it does raise a side question too on this is, what is your opinion about the idea that Hitler didn't die and was actually shipped to Argentina?
I've never actually believed it, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
Heard it. If somebody was able to produce for me genuine evidence about it, I'd be like, okay, I mean, there it is. Never could really trust the Russians. But I actually think that Hitler did kill himself there, in the bunker, or else was killed by his subordinates who did go to Argentina.
Yeah, right. Well, there's
Actually, that latter one makes better sense to me, that I'm thinking about it, that at the end they would have killed him and left with themselves.
Yeah, highly possible if they could get out of Berlin with the Allies on one side and the Ruskies on the other. But the recent thing that I was watching was this video. You know, these are conspiracy videos, so I take it with a grain of salt because I'm like, okay, you're all right. But there are two things they brought up, which I need to verify. One is that the president of Argentina, I think, just recently released a document that corroborates the idea of Hitler being in Argentina at that time.
He released all the materials that Argentina has on it. What it really corroborates.
Put that out later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, just having trouble speaking tonight. Is the extensive presence of the Nazi spy network throughout Argentina.
That's interesting.
That's what, and they are actually very interesting to see how extensive. It's like the opening of the Venona files from the Soviet Union to see just how extensive the KGB stuff was. The infiltration of Argentina by the Nazi secret police was much more extensive than I had known.
Yeah,
and it is why people, very high-ranking members of the administration in the Nazi regime, found their way to Argentina because the SS had prepared a place for them there already.
Well, I would not be surprised at that at all, and I wouldn't be surprised if as you mentioned, the ideas that led up to National Socialism that got their genesis in America have not really ever died. They've just morphed and taken on new monikers, new names. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
One of them was the corruption of the environmentalist movement, which didn't start with them, but it became them.
Yes, very much so, among others. I mean, yeah.
I mean, when you and I were young, the environmentalist movement really was, let's make sure we're not polluting our rivers and our forests. And it was while we were teenagers that it started to become,
right,
or we need just to kill people because they're the source of the pollution.
Right, and dump orange sauce all over the paintings and all that other kind of crap they're doing now. So, but yeah, they became a terrorist group, and this is where I don't know. I oftentimes tend to think that there's some kind of a conspiratorial, centralized, coordinated activity going on with the things that you see around you. But I don't know if it's that entirely. I think I subscribe more to the George Carlin idea when he talked about this, and the comedian.
Yeah, I know.
And he said something to the effect of these people that he was talking about, they're part of a private club and we're not in it. And he said they don't need to get together and put their heads together and talk in whispers. They all went to the same schools. They all shared the same ideas. They all attend the same country clubs. They all fly to the same spot to have meetings together. There doesn't have to be this coordinated activity. It's just like-minded people acting in a certain way. And I think that I think when I think about either the movement in the 30s in Germany or the movement in the 50s in the CIA, I'm thinking, I know the CIA brought on a number of ex-Nazis into America and smuggled them out for the rocket, knowledge, but also smuggled out other people
The
too.
programs, yes.
And
Operation Paperclip had a lot of them.
yep, and certainly there's a lot of talk about the idea that there were these Nazis who were in the CIA, even when JFK had his little, boo-boo there in Dallas. But I think that I think it doesn't have to be a direct correlation between these different movements. I think it's just that there's an idea that drives people in a certain direction, and that direction ends up coordinating together. So,
if I may point out an example where we understand that that's exactly how it works. Consider racism against blacks. Not as if there is a central meeting of the Ku Klux Klan that hands out orders to everybody and this is what you're going to do. It's just that among the crowd that subscribes to the racist viewpoint, they're like, well, yeah, blacks are inferior and therefore we're going to act that way. They assume that because that's the way they are.
yeah.
But there's no central meeting, no order that comes down and says do it that way. Just have a common set of assumptions.
And I think that's the way it generally works. Now, I know that the Swansea Conference was a real thing. I know that Swansea Conference was a real thing. I know that there was a centralization of the Ku Klux Klan in the 50s. I know that there was a meeting of the highfalutin wealthy during the 1880s after the financial crisis of 83. These things really did occur. But I think that the ideas that these people were, all of them espousing, had infiltrated into the culture so that they didn't have to put foot soldiers into motion. The foot soldiers would simply say, yeah, this is what we're doing. This is the way forward. We share the same mentality with Mr. Grant, Mr. Madison Grant.
Well, that's the same thing right now with the people that are deciding to do all the defacing and vandalism of Tesla stuff.
Good point.
It's not like that there's a central committee saying, okay, we're going to hit these Tesla places today and these ones tomorrow.
Right, but it isn't. It isn't a central committee.
No, it's just a group of people that have decided, yeah, this is what we'll do.
Yeah, and I think that from what I can tell, there are certain agents provocateurs that do plant or seed or walk among the crowds to make sure that certain things happen. I mean, we saw that here in Minneapolis for sure. But they don't have to get together with every member that's going to be participating and say, let's do this in a sort of military fashion. So and how does that occur? I think to some degree is why it's important to look at somebody like H.G.Wells. It's not just masochism, it's more how does the mentality that drives this kind of activity actually infiltrate into the public? So for instance, I don't think Wells, like any human, he changed his ideas over time, but he doesn't change them terribly much away from his original progressive ideas. He's part of the Fabian Society, and then they kicked him out for the womanizing, thing. But his fiction, for instance, which I think is still worthwhile, it's very good to read, seems to have in it a tacit agreement with a great many things that show up in this Open Conspiracy book. So even if you're not wanting to read the Open Conspiracy, it's boring. It's just like a philosophical treatise, and like Mein Kampf, it kind of goes on and on after a while.
Badly written, too.
Badly written, yeah. But War of the Worlds, or Island of Dr. Moreau, or Time Machine.
Not badly written.
No, these are very intriguing works, made into a number of different movies. And the public, I hate to use that term, but the public, which can't generally be bothered to read. I mean, literally, it's not putting them down. They don't have
time.
They don't have time. They have jobs. They're exhausted. They have kids. Who's going to have time to read the Open Conspiracy, for crying out loud? But you do have time to watch a version of The Time Machine, or to read The War of the Worlds, or to, that kind of thing. So the ideas get disseminated into the general populace. And then I think that people are like, yeah, sounds like a good idea to do this blotting out of the sky in order to preserve the environment, right?
Yeah,
works, you know?
moron came up with that idea.
I stunning. I find it really stunning. Not just that, but this idea of, I just read about this the other day, if I get this right, it's putting what was it? It was putting something into meat to treat meat. Um,
Something
oh,
into treat meat.
yeah. Well, oh gosh, I have to come back to you on this. But it was an article about putting something into meat. It was a proposal to put something into the meat that's generally given out to people that would enhance their DNA. You know, it's like a what's the technology that was used for the vaccine? RNA, like
Yeah, it's
what's it called?
messenger RNA technology that
Yeah,
causes certain proteins to be expressed.
yeah, yeah,
They want to put that into beef.
yeah. It was a proposal to do this. You know, and again, it's like you shake your head. You say, "Did you ever watch the frickin' show?" You know?
Actually. So that whole thing with let's put particulates into the air to darken out the sun. Didn't they measure what happened with the Canadian wildfires years before?
You'd think
Because that is a
that would have
excellent example of lots of particulate matters of a known quantity blotting out the sun. You know
right.
what the fact is. You've seen it.
1812, right? 1812.
Oh
That
yeah, when the volcano went off?
yep.
Was that 1812 or 1816?
It was
Not
18.
that it matters. It was the volcano that went off.
Well, it was 1812. The volcano went off. 1813 was the year without a summer, I think, and that's when Frankenstein was written and was published in 1814.
Okay.
I get my dates right, which I probably don't because I'm not really an historian. I just play one.
No, and it doesn't matter at a certain point. The point is that volcano went off and blotted out the sun, and then there was no summer the next year.
Yeah, boom, we get Frankenstein. So hell, man, don't do that again. Um, but yes, or even if you don't have the natural phenomenon happening all the time that actually shows that this is a really bad idea, you get movies like The Matrix. I mean, in the Animatrix, that's how the basically the robots, the machines, destroy humanity. Well, let me take it back. The humans try to stop the machines by blotting out the sun because most of the machines gain their power from solar power. And the machines basically find a workaround, unlike your AI that you were talking about earlier. The machines find a workaround, which is that they all become battery powered. And that's why they use the humans as the batteries. So it actually works against the humans in the end to blot out the sun. But there's that great scene in the Animatrix where the humans actually do exactly what's being proposed of blotting out the sun, you know. Just it's absolute insanity. But it goes back.
Unless the point is not to cool the earth, but to kill billions of people from starvation and cold. In which case, it's insane, but it will work exactly as intended.
And why would you suggest that? Not you, like I wouldn't suggest it because I think you're spot on. But why would you suggest? What would lead one to suggest that anybody would have such a horrendous idea?
Well, there's this book by H.G.Wells called The Open Conspiracy. It's actually proposed in there, you know. It's also the proposal of the entire eugenics movement that keeps saying we need to reduce the population of the world down to what is it, like a couple 100 million.
And there's Paul Ehrlich who wrote this interesting book called The Population Bomb.
They
Yep.
keep over and over again, they keep proposing the solution to all the world's problems is kill the people.
Yeah, and then we'll save humanity.
Then we'll save humanity because we'll have killed all the people.
Which sounds a lot like who is that? It sounds like a guy I saw in a movie, a villain. Oh, that's right, Mr. Rogers.
No, I know who you're talking about. You mean the Marvel
Thanos
villain, Thanos.
is Mr. Death, Thanos himself. Thanos means death in Greek. Is
Yeah,
Mr.
that's a good point.
So why? Oh gosh, like you said, you want to go up to some people and just, you know, it doesn't always work to do that, and you get tackled by the security guards. But
And then they say you're the violent one because you're stopping a person from killing multiple billions of people.
well, you know, that's nut
Are
bag,
you crazy? Are you out of control?
right? Oh yeah, so all you're left with is just bitching and then stockpiling goods in case anything does happen. But so okay, so let me go to the text itself, because I was noticing things when I was doing a little prep for this today, and I want to call up the text here on the screen so that
Well,
anybody who
you
does
get
have the
agreement.
fortune of viewing this video.
Oh,
Let's see where. Okay, all right. So here, a couple things as we're going through this. Um, He says, first off, fundamentally, the open conspiracy must be an intellectual rebirth. Now, I found that a really interesting line, and he sets it off from the rest of the text, intentionally so.
you find it funny because it means a renaissance?
Well, that's on one hand. It has startling connections to the Renaissance of the 1500s, where they also thought that they had to have an intellectual rebirth in order to save society from the darkness of the 1300s. And admittedly, the 1300s were not a fun era to be alive.
No.
They weren't a fun era to die. If you're
But a
gonna,
lot of people did. I mean, it certainly was a great experiment for what happens when you wipe out 1/3 of the world's population.
it was, wasn't it? But we
Yeah.
can't really call the Illuminati responsible for that one, can we? The,
No, no, we can't. That one actually just is natural.
that was just
It
not
happens every once in a while. But you know what? Like the Canadian wildfires, it's also a very good case study to tell you what will happen if you kill 1/3 of the world's population.
right, right. Because during the 1300s, you had the starvation of 1315, I think it was.
Hmm.
You had the Black Death of 1347. You had the Hundred Years' War that annihilated so much of the population. And you had recurring instances of the Black Death coming back again and again and
Yeah.
again.
Oh yeah.
Till 1/3 of the population was gone. So you had a huge amount of death that occurred, and certainly it caused some positive things, if anything could be positive brought out of that. The desire for of peasants to improve their lot, to realize that they were valuable because there were so few of them left, that they could now demand pay for their labor, which is a first in society. The creation of paper being printed and the codex being available to a lot of people, and so education. So there are some things that came out of it, like, okay, that would never have happened had we not had the population diminished. More goods for people, certainly. More people had access to luxury goods they hadn't had before. But on the other hand, I think, okay, if we go back to the 1300s, would anybody want to time travel and live in that era? And the answer would probably be a resounding no. No. Because if you didn't die by starvation, which was always a perennial problem before the Industrial Revolution, it was always a perennial problem. If you didn't die by starvation, you'd die by the Black Death, which was wiped out again by the invention of certain medicines. Um, and if, for instance, you didn't die by the Black Death, you'd die by being skewered, either by an Englishman or a Frenchman. So yeah, bad time to be alive. It's true.
Yes, and even the points that you brought up that were, as you said, the good points, the good things that resulted from it. The reason that peasants hadn't fought for their individual rights in the 1200s is because they were treated well in the 1200s.
They were. Yes, they
Um,
were.
it's not a problem if things are doing well for you. Um, the invention of the printing press and of paper and of general and the codex, I'm not sure you're correct, actually, that would never have happened. And I could make the argument that many of these technological things that came about were delayed because of what happened when you wiped out 1/3 of the world's population.
I'll buy that. I'll buy that.
I
I'm,
actually think that in the 1200s, when Francis Bacon was already talking about how to make carriages which are drawn by no horse, but instead by engines made by man in the 1200s.
yeah. Yeah.
If people had been alive to make it, that would have happened a lot sooner
It's a
than
good point.
when it was finally invented in the late 1700s.
It's a good point. I think that I'm going back to the argument that's made in the series Connections by Dr. J. What is his name? Anyway, the series Connections, where he makes the point that the massive amounts of death left all this linen behind, and the linen was then converted easily into paper. And so you had linen paper rather, you had feathers cap, I think it's called, paper rather than vellum, which allowed the printing press, which had existed before, to be more readily used, and movable type, which was also employed at the same time. Movable type allowed for the creation of lots of less expensive libelous books, small books that could be carried around, and so the information was more easily disseminated, and also pamphlets, because you could also print a pamphlet on this paper. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm going back to. But I agree with you that it could have been that these things were delayed, that they might have come earlier, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that we have to consider is that before the 1300s, there was a much warmer climate too in Europe.
Yeah,
So,
it's much easier for people.
yeah. So I guess the point being is that the massive amounts of death that occurred in the 1300s that led up to the first, if you will, Renaissance, although it's actually the second one because you have the Charlemagnean, Carolingian Renaissance before that, that led up to the Renaissance. It's kind of like what Wells is suggesting here. Wells is sort of saying that we need to have a Renaissance, especially an intellectual Renaissance, in our modern era. And
The next two paragraphs, and we can tear that one apart right there. But
right.
yes, I agree. That's what he's saying. Read those two paragraphs, and then, as I have pointed out before, we will discover how his words don't mean the same thing.
No, they don't. And I disagree with him when he's writing here after the war. Because when you look back at the actual intellectual level of people in the 19th century, it's phenomenal. To me, it's really phenomenal. Even lower class people were remarkably intelligent. So to have an intellectual rebirth is a very provincial view on the part of Wells. It's very either it's provincial or it's calculated, one or the other. But so anyway, that was interesting. But then, yeah, here's the next bit that he says. Human thought is still very much confused by the imperfection of the words and other symbols it employs, and the consequences of this confused thinking are much more serious and extensive than is commonly realized. Now, I totally disagree with him on this. The idea that human thought is much confused, like that is, where do you get the evidence for this, Wells? I mean, we said this before. He makes these claims and there's nothing to back them up.
I know, but he states it as if it's a fact.
Right.
And his following sentences, which you normally would think would be supporting sentences, as we read them, you're going to see they're not really.
No, they're just him saying the same thing or his own ideas on things, much like Hitler's Mein Kampf in a lot of ways. But it's so interesting that when he calls it confusion, when you realize what he's actually talking about and how wrong his version of this is, I find that fascinating. So he says, we still see the world through a mist of words. Okay.
A mist of words, yes.
It's just a phrase. It is only the things immediately about us that are plain fact. Through symbols, and especially through words, man has raised himself above the level of the ape and come to a considerable mastery over his universe. But every step in his mental ascent has involved entanglement with these symbols and words he was using. In other words, we need to get away from these symbols and words. That's the problem, is we think in terms of symbols and words, and we need to expunge this from the mind. We have to get rid of the symbols and words. And, well,
I'm keeping my mouth shut for a moment.
Okay. They were at once helpful and very dangerous and misleading. A great part of our affairs, social, political, intellectual, is in a perplexing and dangerous state today because of our loose, uncritical, slovenly use of words. And here's the paragraph where I just thought, okay, you are so off. He says, all through the later Middle Ages, there were great disputes among the schoolmen about the use of words and symbols. And he's talking about the Scholastic Debate, obviously. There is a queer disposition in the human mind to think that symbols and words and logical deductions are truer than actual experiences, which is a Platonic idea, but he calls it a queer disposition. And these great controversies were due to the struggle of the human intelligence against that disposition. These great controversies due to the struggle of human intelligence against that disposition.
Against the disposition to think that symbols are important.
Yes. Yes. Or that to think that symbols have a connection to something beyond this world.
I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be able to bite my tongue, but go as long as we can.
I won't go much longer, just to this salient point. On the one side were the realists, who were so called because they believed, in effect, that names were more real than facts. And on the other side were the nominalists, who from the first were pervaded by a suspicion about names and words generally, who thought there might be some sort of catch in verbal processes, and who gradually worked their way towards verification by experiment, which is the fundamental thing about experimental science. Experimental science, which has given our human world all these immense powers and possibilities that tempt and threaten it today. These controversies of the schoolmen were the utmost importance to mankind. The modern world could not begin to come into existence until the human mind had broken away from the narrow-minded verbalist way of thinking, which the realists followed. Okay, go.
Well, first of all, I just want to point out, if you go back a paragraph before this, when he's talking about lifting yourself above the level of the apes, then he gets down to, and only deal with actual experience. What do you think that all of our apine primitive ancestors dealt with? What do you think the modern apes deal with, if not the experience they presently have? The symbolic way of thinking is actually one of the most extraordinary abilities to see a thing which has not yet become real and see a path towards making it become real. That is exactly what symbols do for you. And not just as utility either. It gives you an understanding of the structure of things when it's bigger than you are. His whole way of thinking right here, as he slams down on what he calls the realists, I don't believe that they were called the realists, as he slams down on them, is a person who thinks there is nothing bigger than me. Therefore, if I have not seen it, it is not important. And that is a really juvenile way of thinking.
Yeah, very myopic. Yeah.
Okay. Now that I've said that, you also can jump in on that thing about the controversy about the nominalists.
Well,
because he's
first, he oversimplifies the problem like nothing else. I mean, it's amazing to oversimplify the problem this much and then base so much of your proposed plan to fix the world on this misconception.
Especially since he makes one of the two sides just sound like they were populated by only a bunch of morons who happen to have power. And the other side were the enlightened one. No, that is not what happened.
So, like, for instance, just in this, here's the space that is given to the realists. Here's the space that is given to the nominalists.
That's a good point.
That alone should...
That's 90-10 split right there. Yes.
Slight element of bias. But he misrepresents the two positions as well. Because, first off, realists and nominalists were in a healthy discussion one with the other in the universities of Paris and of Oxford and also even of Cologne. So they were in a healthy discussion, and they were discussing about the connection of ideas to reality itself. They're also in a discussion about the use of ideas and how ideas should be used. Both realists and nominalists believed in religion and the importance of religion. None of the nominalists would say that religion was unimportant. The realists and the nominalists both also understood the power of symbols. They were very conscious of that, and they knew that they were important. So none of them would just write them off. The real kernel of the debate was whether or not the symbols that we use, everything from like the crucifix to the number 7, whether or not these symbols were connected to a metaphysical world or whether they were a catch-all phrase for general human experience. That's the difference between the two camps. It has nothing to do with one being clouded over, what did he call it, a mist of some kind? A symbolic
mist of words.
Mist of words.
Mist of words.
It has nothing to do with that. So the nominalists and the realists really did have a healthy respect for one another, even if they had a constant battle with one another intellectually. And much of that had to do with the infusion of Aristotelian thought into a predominantly Platonic thinking system as well.
Yes, because from the very beginning, Plato and Aristotle had this dispute of the two different ways of thinking.
Absolutely.
And both are right.
Absolutely.
Both are wrong.
But even this controversy between the two groups carried on for several hundred years. It wasn't like it just like it wasn't like the realists dominated Europe and everybody was just a slave to the realists, and the nominalists were some kind of freedom fighters or something like that.
No.
No, it was a healthy debate that was going on for quite some time.
Nor were the nominalists engaged in this experimental science. That's silly.
No, not at all. And the idea too that all this is separate from what the nature of religion is, as he says later on, is it's so completely off, because both the nominalists and the realists were united eventually through this concept of what the Eucharist is. Thomas Aquinas even talks about this, that the Eucharist is the central piece of this debate, this discussion, whether you are a nominalist or a realist. And that same thing is actually reflected later on during the Renaissance, but it's reflected later on in the painting of the School of Athens, and the counter painting on the other side of the wall, which is, I forget the name of it, but it's like the Triumph of the Eucharist or something like that. So the Eucharist and the School of Athens are two paintings that sit across from each other, and the central place of the Eucharist, which is surrounded by all the saints, if it's transposed over to the other wall, falls right in between Aristotle and Socrates.
Mhm.
Socrates is pointing up to the things of the
Yes.
heavens, and Aristotle is pointing down to the things of this earth. The point being is that the Eucharist ends up uniting these two contrary or paradoxical visions, which, to be honest, every human of any kind of worth has to hold. It's not like one can be completely realist and never ask any questions, nor can you be completely nominalist and say it's all BS. So, well,
No, just one of those things in terms of that prejudice is that, oh, you have to be one or the other, and oh, it's all so opposed to Christianity. I often have so many people that are surprised when I show them that the what we call the scientific method was not created by Francis Bacon in the I'm sorry, I'm forgetting which century we're talking about, the 17th century,
yeah,
but it was created by Thomas Aquinas and his
yes,
teacher Albertus Magnus, and the colleague with whom I believe they only corresponded, Roger Bacon, excuse me, same last name right there, who were all monks. All three of them were monks. And it's not a different Thomas Aquinas from the one everyone thinks of with theology. It's the same Thomas Aquinas.
yeah,
They
right.
had this lively experimental science that they did.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we're talking a debate, a very serious debate that really was dominating Europe for, back to Aristotle and Socrates, 500. We're talking almost 1,500 years or more.
Mhm.
It was not something which, like Wells wants to say here, which is just one side or the other dominating over the other. You
Yeah, Wells takes the attitude, if you read this chapter, that until he came along, nobody ever thought this way. No,
know?
his ideas are totally original. Now we need to have this great mental awakening. Blah blah blah.
Thank God for Herbert G. Wells or whatever.
Yeah.
Almost said Herbert Walker Bush. No, but here's another thing too, is that even in the realm of, okay, let me back up. I just did a whole conversation with my son about this. It's fresh in my mind. The whole Platonic universe is based upon the idea of a correlation of one thing to the other. Um, uh, Symbols, for instance, are correlating to ideas or phenomenon or objects. And we use the symbols in order to understand these things. But the symbols and the objects are correlating to something beyond this world, Plato suggests. And we move from one symbol or idea or thought to another idea or thought, another idea or thought, greater and greater thought, up this chain of being, as Plato called it, and the medievalists developed it, until we get to the very source of everything, which is the good itself. And Plato suggests that the thing that holds these correspondents together is the Greek word pistis. It's faith. Faith itself, which is an often misconstrued idea in the modern world, because we think it's like, oh, you have to have a funny feeling in your tummy about Jesus or something. Faith is the glue that holds human thought together. If you don't think that the words that you're talking, that the sounds you're making, the things you're writing on the page, if you don't think they have any connection to a real thing, you can't have a conversation about diddly squat. If you don't think that the symbols that you're using have a connection to something else, then every symbol is worthless, and every government is impossible, and every human society is an impossibility. Pistis, trust, the trust that I have that what I'm talking to is you and not an AI, for instance. It all of our actions revolve around or are glued together more like by this pistis, this trust. If we move to realism alone, that pistis then becomes a sort of, it's like the glue dries, and we automatically think that this symbol is definitely the way the world works, you know. And every time we see red, for instance, that's a portent of danger and warning. And every time that a bird flies across the sky, it means that the god wants this to happen. You know, we become, it's almost like a magical sense of the world, but not in a good way. You know, and every time we are purely nominalists, the glue melts and disappears. And oh my gosh, I never thought about this point. The glue melts or disappears, and then every symbol is broken away from every other, and we become almost schizophrenic. We can't talk, we can't act. We sit there and scream and on the pavement at everybody that goes by, although that seems to be happening a lot now.
Is I actually will point out, since you're saying right now, one of the things that is true right now with the people that seem to hold the viewpoint that words don't necessarily mean anything. For them, it all devolves down towards, can I get power? And the words you use are just, do they get me power or not?
And
Not
that's,
the meaning.
you're absolutely right. And that your comment is moving the conversation exactly where I want to go. So um,
Well, there's a reason they call me a super genius.
that's right, exactly. Only one hand can rule the ring at once. Um, the idea of pistis or truss is either going to become too hardened, or it's going to melt. And if it's too hardened, then we become superstitious. And if it melts, then we become basket cases. We make no sense at all. And the only thing we're left with, I would say, in both cases, is power itself. The dominance over others from our either concretized ideas, or the dominance over others because we can't hold any idea, and so we look for a strong man to help us. But it's interesting, when I was saying that, I just suddenly thought of the example that Rene Descartes uses when he is doing his little thought experiment. I forget the name of the work in which he does this, but he talks about wax he picks up and he holds in front of the flame, and how it melts in his hands and isn't the same stuff anymore. And then he thinks about himself and how he's malleable, and he says basically, if all this stuff of me goes away, how do I know that there's a me there? And then he comes all the way back to the point where he says, I know that I exist because I think. Cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Which in many ways is a turning on the head of the old way, which is I know God exists and therefore I am, right? But Rene Descartes, who's kind of the grandpappy of the Enlightenment, is doing this wax experiment and applying it to himself. And that's interesting, wax. I never thought of that before. That's what I'm talking about when I say glue, pistis, trust. It's wax. It's the wax that holds the things together. I hadn't thought about that. That maybe Rene Descartes was already, in his nominalist way, breaking down that glue. So, interesting. But anyway, back to Wells. So Wells makes this claim, right? And in making this claim, he completely mischaracterizes the realist and nominalist movement.
And close it up with a pointless and stupid personal anecdote.
Yes, exactly. But pointless and stupid on the one hand, but revelatory on the other. Because when I'm reading through this about his education and how he was so jaded and all this when he realized that his whole world was broken down and he'd been stupid, I'm realizing, on the one hand, that this whole introduction of nominalist thinking was on the ascendant in education there in the 1880s and 1890s when Wells would have been educated. So that the old way of education, which is an education in faith and pistis, real faith, was already being phased out. I hadn't thought about this until I was reading this passage earlier. It was being phased out because then Wells talks about how basically, as he says here, I was in a reverie of unrealities, blind, slovenly, hypnotized, base, and ineffective, blundering about in an extremely beautiful and an extremely dangerous world. So he's looking back on his previous world, the Belle Epoque, or whatever we want to call it, and saying that it was hypnotic, but he was slovenly and blind in the midst of it when he thought that there was still this connection. It's revelatory in the idea that Wells is a man, he has all the flavor of a guy who had a religious sense, and then that was crushed, and he flips and becomes this sort of activist instead. He loses his religious fervor for the real, and he has a religious fervor for changing the world or fixing the world. So it's very revelatory about his character, I think. And then, yeah, and then he says this, I set myself to re-educate myself, and I was going to do all this stuff, and I wrote all these books. And he says, here it is. Our school teachers have had no proper training themselves. They miseducate by example and precept, and so it is that our press and current discussions are more like an impromptu riot of crippled and deaf and blind minds and an intelligent interchange of ideas. What bosh one reads, what rash and impudent assumptions, what imbecile inferences. Goodness gracious, Wells, there's a lot of
Though I do point out for all these people that think the greatest way of learning is to start again from the beginning every single time. You actually don't get very far, even up to the point of inventing the wheel if you start new every single time.
No, you don't.
It's all supposed to be a conversation of the ideas that have come before.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The flaw, which Wells shares,
Yep.
is this belief that actually all of the sum of knowledge is fixed and it's already been discovered if it's worth discovering. So we need to trash it all so there's something new to discover after it's been trashed.
Yeah, and
That's the way it goes.
you're absolutely right. And there are three things that come to mind when you're talking about that. One is this tremendous arrogance, as we've said before about Wells, that everybody out there is ignorant. I know the truth. I will share it. Everybody else is ignorant. Now, we talked about how it may not be a central committee of the Fabians, but it may be that they're agents of the Fabians, so to speak, who run around. I can't help but think that that's one of the key elements of the agents of the Fabians. This arrogance, this sense that I know better than everybody else, and I'm going to show the world. I'm going to fix the world because I know the truth. You don't have to have a central committee. Wells got kicked out for his philandering. But he was still on the run with his ideas about his Fabian ideas about how he was going to fix the world. So, and it really comes out here with this. Everybody, all these school teachers, they all suck, and people are reading magazines and going to movies, which leads me to the second thing that occurs. Adolf Hitler says the exact same thing in Mein Kampf. All T. Yeah. He talks about the poor education of Germans and how there's all this garbage that's being spewed out to the minds of the individuals and how people entertain themselves reading smut and trash magazines and going to see lousy movies. And all this is contributing to the downfall of society, and we have to fix it. Isn't that interesting?
That's very interesting. As I've pointed out, even in this discussion, it doesn't start out as the monster. It starts out as human, and something you think, okay, maybe that's correct. But the arrogance that is shown with either one of those viewpoints is saying, well, clearly I'm smarter than all of my teachers.
Sure.
Honestly, there's really only a handful of people in all of history for whom that was actually true. And mostly they were actually fairly decent people as well.
Yeah, and this lack of mercy that occurs,
Yeah. Yes.
Well,
destroy them all.
Yeah. Just to accept the fact that people are flawed. And some people know more than others, it's true, but they do the best they can. They're not idiots just because they don't think the same thing you do. Here's an interesting little factoid. Open Conspiracies, 1928. Mein Kampf, 1925. Who influenced whom? Isn't that something? And I wanted to check on this too. Gödel's incompleteness theorem, 1931. Why do I bring that up? Because both this work and this work are attacking to some degree the old way, the old transmission of things. And Gödel's incompleteness theorem, whether he intended it or not, is a counterbalance to a similar type of idea that was prominent in the 30s. My understanding, I may be wrong on this, is that there was a conference going on where all these mathematicians were like, we can understand the entire world. Mathematics will explain everything. Mathematics is the best thing in the world. We can move forward into a bright sunny future. And Kurt Gödel got really disturbed by all this, and he went to prove in set theory, basically constructed set theory, he proved that mathematics can't prove its own existence. In other words, he proved that mathematics itself was founded upon trust or faith, pistis. So all this idea of we don't need religion, we don't need this faith business anymore because math will explain everything, or you could say science or rational thought or whatever. Gödel basically just destroyed that with this idea, this incompleteness theorem. Threw the whole thing into a tizzy. Caused yelling and screaming to occur at the conference, from what I understand. So
the mathematicians weren't calm and rational, just debating ideas back and forth by experiment.
Surprise!
Just as a grim, amusing point of trivia, that the profession which actually has the highest rate of suicide actually is set theory mathematicians.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, why would that be, I wonder?
I have no idea why, to tell you the truth. I don't see anything particular within that profession that makes you think, oh, you're going to kill myself.
Yeah, I know.
Odd, curious, but true fact.
I don't know enough about set theory to be able to say anything. I know that the movie of Oppenheimer was particularly intriguing for this sort of suggestion that a man who would, like Oppenheimer, who would come up with the idea of splitting the atom, is a man who was deeply disturbed already about the nature of the universe. Powerful movie to that effect. Powerful movie. Even his last statement to Einstein has to be taken with a grain of salt. He says he was afraid that they actually did destroy the world, but that it's not that they did destroy the world. It's that that's what a guy like that comes to think, that the world has already been destroyed. It's already been annihilated.
Good point. Good point.
So anyway, back to our man, because I want to finish up here with this, because this gets us into a really good spot to talk about the religion section. But he says here, I'm re-educating myself. I'm getting my mind healthy. I'm very healthy. Very
extremely healthy all the time. Don't you see the connections?
The right things. Hard drinks. To think properly, it's only the beginning of the task before the awakening open conspirator. So everybody has to do this, right? He is not only to think clearly, but he has to see that his mind is equipped with the proper general ideas to form a true framework for his everyday judgments and decisions. And I got to this line, I'm like, buddy, you're already so far off the rails, and you're saying we need to form a true framework, and you're throwing out the old framework?
So I'm going to point out a certain truth in what he's saying right there. In order for you to accept these crazy things as true, you do have to actually throw yourself off the rails a little bit first. Otherwise, you're going to look at it and say, that's crazy. We're all going to die. Don't do that.
Yeah.
And then you don't do it anymore.
Like blotting out the sun or putting fluorine into the water system,
Among other things, yes, those are good examples.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I really do need to go back and go through the history of who first came up with the idea of putting fluorine into the water all over the place, because speaking as a chemist, that's actually a really poor idea.
Very.
I'd like to find out who thought it was good, which person did it, because it's not a faithless group of people.
Right.
This is some one individual said this will be good.
And it could have come down to a corporation that was pushing their product. The same thing with DDT. DDT was a corporation pushing its product, as was aspartame, as was the corn syrup.
Leaded gasoline. That's another great one.
Yep. Yep. So it may not have been one genius. It might have been, the CEO and the board geniuses. Who knows? Who knows? One or the other. It's remarkable when you look back, especially in the 20th century, at all these people that had a proper general idea and a true framework to frame their everyday judgment and decisions, making these absurd decisions like, let's blend the DNA of humans and pigs. Let's what was the other one? Let's wipe out all fungus in the dirt. What was that one?
Somebody actually proposed that. I've never heard that. That is a very poor idea.
Oh, I gotta say, this was on a video I watched of it's like 10 times that the world almost came to an end. Okay. It was the proposal to actually kill fungus and bacteria in the earth that was harmful to plants. And in doing so, it would necessitate the killing, or could risk the killing of every fungus in the earth.
Oh, wait, I think I heard this one. Okay, go on, go on, go on.
I'm not sure.
My memory's coming back towards this.
I don't know why it was not put into place, but had it been put in place, it would have caused a chain reaction that would have destroyed fungus, because it would spread one to the next, to the point where every fungus in the soil around the planet would have been wiped out. And if you know, but if you know anything
I
about
love fungus. I know.
the action of plants with the fungus in the earth, you know that that would mean a chain reaction that would kill every piece of vegetable matter on the earth, right?
So there was a friend of mine not long ago who was going through some very bad times, and she posted a meme on Facebook that said, um, just remember that you can't be like this mushroom and think that the end result is only the mushroom. You first have to cultivate networks and relationships. And I pointed back to her and said, dear, you don't understand. Before a mushroom ever sticks that portion up above the soil that we think is the mushroom, they put out these networks that stretch miles
Yeah,
and
right.
share nutrients from one thing to another and create this organization where they're feeding one another. And only then do you finally see a mushroom go up above the ground. So honestly, dear, says I to her, yeah, you've got to be exactly like the mushroom.
Yeah.
Kill yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and so, a scientific idea that would solve our problem of having bad fungus killing our crops would literally kill everything on the planet.
Yes. It's like the idea about wiping out all the bacteria in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
What because they're germs, of course you want to wipe out all germs. No,
Uh-huh.
you really don't want to do this.
Oh, you don't really like killing all the mosquito population. No, you don't want, please don't do that.
As unsympathetic as they are, we don't want to do that.
Oh, no, it's not wise to mess with Mother Nature. But all those ideas came from people, and maybe this gets back to my earlier point. All those ideas came from people who thought that they had the proper general ideas to form a true framework of everyday judgment and decision. They thought this is good. This is a good thing, right?
Well, it's funny that you bring that up because they were the same people that thought that the First World War, known as the Great War, would be a simple little matter that was just going to resolve itself out. And I say that because that's the very next paragraph he talks about, and yet he himself mischaracterizes. And by the way, anybody that has not looked at the First World War, there was so much stupidity that went into that.
There was quite a great deal. I just finished reading, listening to a read through of All Quiet on the Western Front. I've seen the original black and white movie a couple times, and then I watched the new one that was just done.
I've not seen the new one. Is the new one any good?
But it really highlights the senselessness of that whole business and people who thought, like in the reboot, the redo, the last scene is down to the last day, and the commanding officer commands his troops to take back a certain amount of land so that they can go home with the idea that they have conquered this territory for Germany and not gone home dishonorably. Okay, now this is not in the book or in the movie. So in the book, he gets killed, I think, just by a bullet, just in the last few weeks. And in the movie, he's reaching out for a butterfly and he gets shot in the early black and white movie. But it was really interesting in this one because the commander, who's portrayed very poorly, is nevertheless absolutely convinced of the logic and reason of this push. It's this logic and reason of we can't go home dishonorably. We have to do something to help Germany, even in this last moments. We have to have a bargaining chip with the French, et cetera, et cetera. So he's going to throw his entire troop to capture this certain amount of land and hold it there when the 11th hour comes around, on the 11th day of the 11th month. And they do, and they get slaughtered, So, yeah, stupidity, definitely. Definitely. And Wells I don't think Wells fought in the war. I really don't, as far as I know.
I don't believe he was, but one of the things that troubles me with this thing he says about the war is that this whole anecdote is totally unconnected towards what he was saying about having to reform the mind to create this world for the open conspiracy. And it's one of the things where he says he hates the war. Great, we hate the war too. It was stupid and badly done. Great, it was stupid and badly done. And therefore we need to destroy the world and come back to an open conspiracy.
Yeah, and that's
where did you come from?
yeah, completely a non sequitur. I think it goes back to something that Bertrand Russell and other intellectuals of the era were saying, that this war would not have been fought had the scientists and the intellectuals been in control. This war was fought primarily because people
Oh,
who
wait, you're saying that they said that, not that it was
they
true?
said,
Okay, because that's not true, but go
no,
ahead.
no, it's not true. But this is what the really smart people were saying. If, for instance, it had been in the hands of the scientists and the intellectuals, it would have reached over the lines and would have shook hands and have made peace much earlier. And because reason and logic allows us to transcend our more base animalian desires and motives, the intellectuals would have been able to overcome those things and therefore see clearly that war was not a good idea. And
Yeah.
that is really almost exactly what Bertrand Russell says. And so Wells is probably saying the same strand that many of his colleagues were carrying around. Now, it's a complete load of dash. It really is.
Well, one just has to remember the experience of Gödel and the mathematician.
Yeah,
Don't think they're quite as free of their anger and arrogance as they might like to believe themselves to be.
yeah, it's pure hubris. One has to look at any academic and say how much of that person is loaded with hubris and ill advisory, and many of them cheat. Like the president of Harvard or whatever. It's not as though just being intelligent is going to keep you honest and noble and virtuous and true.
No, it's not. There's not a correlation. Now, don't get me wrong, you do get some of these people who were great men of learning and of science and of reason who were also very good men. I mean, Robert Maxwell, the famous Scottish physicist, is an excellent example of a truly good man who was also a genius. But
Yeah.
part of the reason he is such a remarkable man is that with his immense genius, he was very humble about it all.
Mm. Yep, I can see that, and you see that in other people too. My favorite hero, J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Absolute genius when it came to language and writing, literature. Very humble guy, apparently.
Yes.
But you go back in history and you see characters like Thomas Aquinas, who was also very humble, but his colleague Anselm was not. Anselm was very proud, and there's a famous passage, if I remember it, where Anselm denounces one of the nominalists, saying that he's essentially a fool, and that only a fool in his heart would say that there's no God, as Scripture says. And he then goes on to show the ontological proof that God is that which then nothing greater can be conceived. And then by some sort of legerdemain, he shows that anybody who denies this is obviously an idiot and a fool and doing it willfully. And so it's impossible to actually not believe in God. And so Aquinas goes and he takes that whole argument and he puts it into the Summa in this magnificent way, which says basically that self-evident comes in two ways, two flavors. There's self-evident in and of itself and the self-evident to us. And Anselm basically is right that the proposition of God being that than which nothing greater can be conceived is self-evident in itself. But it's not self-evident to an individual person who has to come to believe in the thing. And therefore, right, it's perfectly understandable when someone doesn't believe in God, Aquinas says. In other words, Aquinas is showing tremendous mercy to these people because they fail, they fall down, and Aquinas knows that. Anselm, on the other hand, who was a luminous character in his writing and his stature as a thinker, was absolutely merciless and had this foolish idea that because he believed, everybody should believe, right? Self-evident. So, yeah. Wells,
Just good point that some people who are saints also have flaws like that as well.
absolutely. And some people who are not saints, like Mr. Wells, have a great many flaws. I'm really amazed when I read this work at how influential the work actually was, um, and how this outlining of this conspiracy, the ideas therein, were sort of the playbook in much the way that Steal This Book by Abby Hoffman or The Rules for Radicals were playbooks for the far lefty Communist Party in America. His plan here is to write these three great works, right? This outline of history, and then to follow it up with a second thing, which, as he says, what was it? Was
Science of life is what he
Science
calls
of Life.
it.
That's right. and then the open conspiracy. So it's like, here's history, here's how life works, and here's what we're going to do about it. Interesting idea. Recreating society, rebuilding society. So he has good intentions, one could say. He wants to rebuild society and make it perfect and wonderful so we don't fall into a war like we just came out of. But what is his open plan? What is the plan forward here? Because it's already based upon things that seem to be remarkably bad, remarkably stupid, actually. So anyway, he goes on and talks about himself some more and what are we to do with our lives, blah, 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 blah. And he gets to the end. And he has, okay, first thing we have to do is a revolution in education. Because he says here, what was it? Certainly no one can possibly set about living properly and satisfactorily unless he knows what he is, where he is, and how he stands to the people and things about him.
Yeah, that's not true, by the way.
Yeah.
That's extremely not true.
Interesting line, because it's not true. And the way that he puts it is interesting, but you have your say on why it's not true.
Why is it not true? Because most people who are living real life do not actually know where their status is right now or whether or not they really are choosing the right course at that moment. They're doing the best they can and hoping it works out. And honestly, that actually is the way where you do find, yes, I lived my life properly and I lived my life satisfactory. And I made some mistakes along the way.
Yep.
But it was okay in the end.
Yeah.
That's what real life is like.
Yeah.
As opposed to this idea where you have to never have any mistake at all, or it's all flawed and throw it away.
Yeah. And again, if I'm ascribing the best motives to Mr. Wells here, it would be that his motive is to make society that would never fall into World War I again, the Great War again, and so make society in such a way that we move ourselves out of that calamitous world of the mist of words that leads us to World War I. So that's giving him the most credit. Now, I think he's wrong as the reason why we fell into World War I. But if that's the case, he's wrong, as you're right. He is wrong in that most people do live their lives as best they can, but they don't consider living properly and satisfactorily the goal. They consider living righteously and nobly the goal, or they consider living honorably the goal. So the use of the words properly and satisfactorily are already a very interesting choice on the part of Mr. Wells. Who defines what a proper life is and a satisfactory life is? If the Fabians aren't already planning it, then this wording opens the door for the Fabians to plan it.
Very good point.
It shifts entire dialogue away from live a life that is virtuous and noble and honorable and true to live a life that is proper and satisfactory and materially provided for, which he doesn't add in here, but
I'm actually going to have to confess this is a moment when I did not see something, and it's the very point that I've harped on so often, that he doesn't mean the same thing by words.
yes.
I looked at this passage and I saw no one can set about living properly and satisfactory. And when I first read it, I thought, yes, living your life nobly with regards towards other people. And that's not what he means here. Nobility, virtue are not what he means by proper and satisfactory.
Not the same thing. Not the same thing. Satisfactorily implies a pragmatism. The same kind of things that John Dewey was espousing. Satisfied. You are satisfied, right?
Made enough. That's what the word means. Made enough.
You got all the food you can eat. You got the car, got the house, got the clothes, got the indoor heating, all that crap that the Enlightenment is going to provide for you, right? Or the state, or whatever it is. It's the same vision that we see way back in Looking Backwards, as I was originally harping on that in another video. Edward Bellamy's work paints the rosy picture of a future where Amazon, he doesn't call it that, he calls it the state, but it's Amazon, provides everything for everybody at the click of a button. And where people live in clean and decently built shelters and communities, interacting satisfactorily and properly with each other. I haven't even touched that word properly yet. But Bellamy even makes the point that the major way to do this is to organize society around logic and human thought, and second, to deplete the population by about 50%. So
Always comes down to that, now doesn't it?
always comes down to it's the same thing. These maniacs. Bellamy is pointing out the same thing, though, which paints the rosy picture that then people got together and talked about, how shall we get to that point? And so in some ways, the war, the Great War, prompts folks like Wells and Bertrand Russell and others to really put their noggins to work thinking about how can we get to that Bellamy beautiful picture that Bellamy proposes. One of the things that James Lindsay points out, which I think is very valuable, is when we talk about socialism, right? Marxism, socialism, and communism are three different things. Marxism is that specific route that was laid down by the theories of Karl Marx, but socialism and communism existed before him. Communism is the future, the rosy paradise on earth where all our material needs are given to us because we share everything communally and no government exists. Socialism is the struggle to get to that point and the accommodations we have to make with government until we get to that point, okay? But you see socialism and communism in the works of Bellamy. And Bellamy's proposals are all about living a proper and satisfactory life, which is exactly what Wells is pointing out here. So you could say Wells is a communist, but he isn't really. He's more not really social. He's a progressive, but it's the same damn thing. It's the same thing. It's living a pie in the sky sort of utopia on earth, devoid of any kind of metaphysical connection, because as we see a couple paragraphs above, he completely eradicates that possibility as a bunch of mist of words. But let me another word too here, because I think words are important, unlike Mr. Wells, who has categorically rejected the use of words and then goes
Why he put so many of them down.
He goes on for several chapters to describe how he rejected words. But satisfactory means all your needs are met. Proper is a more interesting word to me because what does proper mean? It means convention. It means treating others decently. It means never talking about certain issues. It means not doing anything that would ruffle the feathers of your neighbors. A proper life is a life of this sort of upper crust, dignified gentleman, if you will. And that's what he's suggesting everybody should be able to live. Not the life of a worker, not the life of a low-base guy who likes fart jokes and likes to watch, Family Guy. That's all base. We want a proper life where you are dignified and you're intelligent and you appreciate the good things like Brahms, for instance. And your life is noble and virtuous.
By the way, for anyone who's listening to that, what that was a reference to was the Wannsee Conference.
Yes. Good for you. Yeah, absolutely. Brahms is the thing. Yeah. And one of the things that you see when you read a work, for instance, like Lois Lowry's book, The Giver, which I highly recommend anybody to read, is that the people in that society are living a very proper and satisfactory life. She's writing in direct opposition to Wells and Bellamy. Whether she did that consciously or subconsciously, I don't know, but the ideas that were floating around when Lowry wrote her work, definitely. So they live a very proper and satisfactory life. The only problem, and the problem that sets her protagonist to do what he does, is that the key to living this proper and satisfactory life is killing the old at a certain age and killing the little kids when they don't meet a certain standard, a certain Spartan physical standard.
When you say that is the Spartan standard, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
They also kill the old?
They did when they got to a certain age.
Okay.
So as the old approached a certain age, they would be euthanized. And it was always very humane, but it was humane and decent. You just didn't talk about it because it's not proper to talk about such things.
Kids, don't be like Sparta.
Right. And I remember this, hearing about this all the time, growing up in the household that we grew up in. Our mom and dad always said that their relations from the South especially didn't talk about certain things, even though those things went on. No, you didn't talk about things like slavery. You didn't talk about things like racism or affairs with other people, or all that stuff. Certainly not contraception and abortion. It just wasn't proper to talk about these things. And so Wells is proposing that everybody lives something like a lie, but it's not a lie because there's no weight to words, right? You just don't talk about certain things, and you live a life of intelligence and dignity where all your needs are met. That's what we're trying to get to. The utopia of tomorrow, the communist utopia of tomorrow, is outlined in Edward Bellamy. And then this last part, as if we weren't disgusted enough. No one could possibly set about living properly and satisfactorily, which is the goal, unless, here's the precursor to this, he knows what he is, where he is, how he stands to the people and things about him. What does he mean by that phrase? He knows what he is, where he is, and how he stands to the people and things about him. Well, the first thing that came to my mind when I read that was Wells, who was educated in classical lit. Because as I'm reading this other book about classical education, they point out that Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton, Tolkien and Lewis, were the last generation educated in the classical mode. And Lewis talks about this in one of his talks, is one of his lectures. What they mean by that is after John Dewey and his ilk had their way, education in England and in America changed radically. And that was right around the turn of the century, 1900, 1910. And it moved from this training in classical lit to a pragmatic training in things that would make you efficient in society. One of the things, and so Wells would have been one of this generation of Lewis and Tolkien. He would have been one of these guys who was educated in classical lit. It's a fair assumption. And in classical world, the paragon of education, the Greeks said, was nothise auton, to know yourself. They espoused that over and over again, and that was a thing that was written over the lintel of the Aristotelian school. Know yourself. But they meant know your place in the universe in relation to the powers that be, the powers that exist, the gods, if you will. Don't have comeuppance. Realize that you're mortal. So that's what nothise auton was. All education was geared towards that. What yes. Clark and Gine call in their introduction to classical education, they call it pietas, piety. Knowledge of what needs to be taken seriously.
And the word that we've used before, humility.
Humility, yep.
Because if we're going to mention some of the things from the Greek world, the story of Icarus is the story of a downfall because a certain person thought the power he'd gotten let him challenge God.
Yep.
And his calamitous ruin because of it.
He Hindenburgs. And what, interesting you bring that up, what is it that causes him to crash into the ocean? For those who don't know, Daedalus is the inventor. He made
I see what you're saying. It was the ruination of the wax.
And the wax.
All the god had to do was warm up the wax.
Wax melt.
Feathers fall off, and he crashes.
He loses his pistis. Yeah. Yes,
and the feathers too.
Yeah, and all the feathers, right.
Sorry, that's a linguistic joke.
So yeah, Wells is, I think, intentionally troping the idea of nothise auton from the classical world here.
For thyself. But he says, know thyself and how you stand in relation to not the gods, but to people.
And things.
As if those are the real gods. Because the realists thought that symbols mattered, but the other ones saw that it was just the facts from experiments, the things around you.
But I mean, think about it. For the pragmatist, things are gods, right? I mean, how do you get immense power?
Well, I'm not disputing that is exactly what the pragmatists think. But
right.
I just brought up Icarus. I'm telling you that the end of that is that you come crashing down and hit the earth hard.
For sure. Absolutely. No, my point is that things are gods. And this is quite striking to me because the pragmatist, the progressive, wants to say that power is in things, as who was the philosopher who was so popular in Nazi society, but he was not a Nazi himself. Not Kierkegaard, but Heidegger, Martin Heidegger.
Heidegger, okay.
Martin Heidegger points out the modern view is that all physical things in the world and humans are simply power to be stored up. It's a very interesting thought because, of course, how does one get the atom bomb? You get the atom bomb by splitting the atom or colliding atoms together, which means every object could, in theory, be made into an atom bomb. Now, that's not entirely true. Obviously, you have to have plutonium and blah, 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 and enriched uranium. But the point being is that the molecules that are in things become the God, become the real power. And then whoever controls that power is able to elevate themselves to a very, very high level where they can actually affect change in the world. Why? Because we have a bomb and you don't. Ha, ha, ha. Isn't that something?
I do see where you're going, and I just say this as a plea to the world to never believe that you have enough power to change the world. All that ever has to happen is God or the earth, who is not God, just flickers his little finger.
Yeah.
And all that power you thought you had is ruined.
Sure enough. Sure enough. It's
Most
also
people can't actually conceive the scale. And this is not theological, this is simply physical. Most people cannot conceive of the scale of what you're talking about with some of these things. When one talks about a volcano going off, most people are incapable of understanding the sheer amount of energy that is in that compared to an atom bomb. And you say, well, it's a million times more powerful than an atom bomb, but people cannot grasp what a million times more powerful than an atom bomb means.
too big. It's too big.
At some point for them, it's all the same. It's an atom bomb versus an asteroid that blows off a quarter of the Earth. It's the same thing. No,
Great,
it's really not.
great depiction. If anybody's interested to watch, is a depiction of Krakatoa, the dramatic depiction of Krakatoa. That is
Very
stunning.
good series, not series, BBC episode, as I recall.
There's maybe a two-part series, but it was absolutely phenomenal. It's just amazing. Krakatoa, for those who don't know, is a volcano that exploded. I think it was in the South Pacific.
Yes,
but
it is.
Exploded at the end of the 19th century. Does that sound right to you?
Right, it was in the 1880s that it went off.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, interesting correlation.
Yes,
And
it is actually probably possibly connected. But
yeah,
just tell about Krakatoa first.
it was huge. It was amazing, just the power that was released when the water poured in there and caused that massive explosion to occur, and the tidal wave that came afterwards. And you get a scene in that movie if this actually happened. It was one of these passenger ships that knew that they're going to be swamped, and so the captain decided to turn the ship into the wave and just riding up this wave, almost vertical to get over this damn thing, and finally makes it over, and they survive. But oh my gosh, terrifying movie.
Yes, and everyone else died.
Yeah, yeah,
They survived,
yeah.
but
Yeah. I mean, if you don't watch that, watch the movie The Impossible, where Spider-Man and Obi-Wan Kenobi,
the actors involved in it at any rate, yes.
yeah, right. And Tia Leone, I think it is also. But anyway, it's or is it Naomi Watts? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But great movies, and they show the scale of this sort of thing happening. And this really startling thing to me is that there are nutbags who think on the one hand they can control something once they release it, and on the other hand, think they can harness this kind of power,
Yeah,
and everything's going to go swimmingly.
that's the Icarus thinking. I'm sorry, you can't control it.
Yep. There's a really good movie called The Sun. I think it's called Sun or Solar. It's one of the two, where they basically fly into the sun, and it's a very stupid scientific premise because they're going to basically toss a nuclear bomb into the sun to reignite it. It doesn't work that way.
Very stupid premise, but go ahead. I've never heard of this movie, but
it's a really good movie, except for the stupid science business that goes on. But one of the points that they make in the movie is the sun is such an entity that it's almost impossible to deny its existence. All the people on the ship are affected differently by the proximity to the sun as they get closer and closer to it. really powerful movie, and they start going a little bit nuts as they get closer to the sun, not just because they're going to get fried, but also because the very effect of the sun, it's just so immense that they can't deal with it, and eventually they all go a little nuts. And that's very much to the point, that when you're dealing with the natural world alone, let alone the metaphysical world, when you're dealing with the natural world, it is so overwhelming that you'd have to be a complete fool to think you could either harness it or control it, once you start some sort of chain reaction, like killing all the fungus in the earth.
I
But
would just ask for anyone who is reading a work like the Open Conspiracy or any of these other ones that are connected that we've talked about to come to it with that mindset, the understanding that the world is actually too immense for you
yeah,
to be able to control anything.
but this is a question too, which maybe we should end on this, but thinking about George Soros, for instance, in his autobiography, where he claims flat out that he's a god.
I have not
Yeah.
seen that, but okay.
The things I do for science. Um, you deal with a guy like that.
You're not exaggerating. He actually does that.
Yeah, he does.
Okay.
That's literally a line out of his autobiography.
Okay.
Um,
God.
guys that think like that are extremely dangerous, first off. But in a strange paradox, no, is that the right word, paradox? In a strange facet of human life, those are the guys who have the acumen to wade through the economic and political world to get to the top. Which means that those are normally the types of guys that end up in ruling positions, law and politics. Not everybody, right? Not everybody, because there are some good people in law, there are some good people in politics, there are some good people in finance. But it's the narcissistic, insane sons of bitches that normally are backstabbing and fighting and clawing their way to the very CEO position that then they can do remarkable damage to everybody else in the entire world. I mean, you think about, I don't know, is Jeff Bezos a guy that you think you would trust with your entire life savings? Probably not.
I will say that he's probably more interested in making rocket ships and companies than he is in being a god.
Thank God for that.
You got that?
Whereas George Soros,
George Soros seems to be more interested in controlling people's lives than
he's
he is in building remarkable financial empires, which he's done too, but mostly that seems to be subservient towards his desire towards controlling other people's lives. Now, why he wants to control other people's lives, I don't know.
well, the other thought on this, and I really do know we have to wrap up, but the other thought on this is that this idea of the dissolution of the wax, the idea that the physical world is all that we have, and that we can manage it, control it. It may appeal to a great many people, but it seems like it most readily appeals to the very people I was just mentioning who think that they're gods, the narcissist types. Whereas the average person who goes through things like breaking a leg or breaking a nose or catching, some disease or some kind of heartache or whatever it is, you get to a certain point where you're like, you get beaten down by the world. You're no longer wanting to save everything. You used to get a much more realistic vision of your limitations and the limitations of the world and what's actually important. And so you're much more, you're not so vulnerable to this idea that somehow we're going to save everything. But this idea does appeal to people who think that they were born to be the savior. They're born to be the solution to the world's problems, like Mr. Wells. I can't help but think that somehow his fooling around with ladies is connected to this very thing. That Wells was not the guy who was looking for a family. He was looking for his next conquest to adore him and worship him.
Yes. And even in the making of children, it's just to prove his immortality.
Yeah. It's like Paul Johnson used to point out about Rousseau, right? He fathered all these children that he refused to pay for and just left them on the doorsteps of orphanages. Yes, go Rousseau. Jeez.
They always hated his stuff.
Oh, I know. But again, another grandpappy, right? Grandpappy of the whole situation. Well,
Instead of trying to reform the entire world, let's go clean up a kitchen.
how about that?
Yeah.
Go clean up a kitchen, make your bed, change your own diaper.
Well, I'm not wearing a diaper, but I take your point, yes.
Uh, uh, I would like to tackle the revolution in education and the revolution in religion next, because I think it's worthwhile. As long as you can have the stomach to go through this, it's a little bit like going through, you know, a gulag or something. But I think it's important, you know, to see these roots of where this stuff comes from and how much of a strain it still has in our current situation. So
Yes, that last thing in particular, we need to see how these are not ideas that died back in the 1930s, but are exactly what's being proposed right now.
oh, nope. If Hitler didn't flee to Argentina, his ideas certainly came over here and haven't left. Yeah. So
That they did.